So the topic tonight is Was Christ Crucified, with a focus on the historicity of the event. Keyword there is historicity. Please let me know in the chat if you can understand how quickly I am speaking. If you don't, please let me know and I will slow down. As a Muslim, I've been told all my life that there were mountains of evidence for the crucifixion of Jesus, the son of Miriam. I've been told that all historians agree that this event was an undisputed fact. Eventually, I decided to look up these claims and I found that they were not mountains, but rather sparse, non contemporaneous claims primarily derived from a particular theological group's faith tradition. Some colleagues and I began live streaming on the EF Dawa YouTube channel, and we quickly encountered a variety of Christians, apologists, and scholars alike who began to make statements which piqued our interest. This was an open forum. Any Christian could come on and give us the evidence for the crucifixion. Dr. Johnson McClatchy of Apologetics Academy argued that the historical testimonies of Flavius, Josephus, Tacitus, and Lucian of Samosata were negligible as historical evidence. Dr. McClatchy further argued that the Gospels were the earliest historical evidence for the crucifixion, but also that the Gospel attributed to Mark, while being the earliest, was incomplete and had a lost ending of an undetermined length. Various other Christians argued that there was no smoking gun for the crucifixion. That person is Michael, and he is in the chat tonight, so he is contradicting himself, but rather a variety of cumulative evidences that support the idea of the crucifixion. To begin with, the Qur'an affirms that the death of Christ in history was made to appear this way. The clear Qur'an by Dr. Mustafa Khattab, which Stephen misquoted, says, "But they neither killed nor crucified him, it was only made to appear so." Curiously, the verse does not say that Allah made it appear so. The word shubbeha is an intransitive verb here. So there goes that argument, Stephen. It, referring to his death, was made to appear so. So, in other words, if we are to look at claims in history about the death of Jesus, we should expect to find that the records do say he was crucified. Therefore, if my interlocutor tonight was to claim that the Quran is in error, then this would not be a valid claim. For the Quran to be in error, it should say that the claim of the crucifixion in history does not exist. Since the opposite is the case, then the Quran is valid in what it says. For my interlocutor to argue against this passage of the Quran, he must therefore prove the claim that the Quran states the crucifixion of Jesus does not appear in historical sources. The Muslim has nothing to lose in this discussion, but rather everything to gain. Within the field of historiography, there is a subfield known as narratology. Professor John Gladys, a historian at Yale University, in his work, The Landscape of History, says on pages 47 and 48 about the sources which historians use. We interpret through our own distinctive viewpoints. It's here that imagination, even dramatization, is involved. Ultimately, though, the product must go before an audience, at which point one of several things may happen. The patrons may approve because what they see confirms their preconceptions. Pay attention to that, Stephen. They may disapprove if it does not. Muslims also pay attention. Or, and this is what paleontologists, tailors, and cartographers, as well as historians, hope for, the product may move those who encounter it to revise their own views so that a new basis for critical judgment emerges, perhaps even a new view of reality itself, end quote. You will notice here that the historian, despite using the terms critical judgment and a new view of reality, does not frame them within the context of being skeptical or hyper-skeptical. Rather, what can be gleaned is that in interpreting the past, asking questions is how they arrive at their conclusions. He emphasizes specifically that this is what encourages people to revise their own views. The question then becomes, between the Muslim and the Christian, who has more to lose if the crucifixion of Jesus is brought into historical doubt? As mentioned above, the Muslim's belief does not change and is not impacted. Historical sources claim he was crucified. This is present and appears to be the case in historical literature. This affirms what the Quran says. On the other hand, if the crucifixion narrative is brought into doubt, what does the Christian have to lose? everything. So if the question tonight is one of bias or about determining who is arguing through necessity for the defense of one's faith, then it is not the Muslim who needs to account for their belief, but rather the Christian. The Christian stands to lose everything if the crucifixion is in doubt. Please keep this essential point in mind as we work through our dialogue. In the work The Resurrection of Jesus, a New Historiographical Approach, Dr. Michael Locona mentions on page 105 that as a result, historians, especially those who study antiquity, speak of the probable truth of a theory rather than absolute certainty. In other words, when historians determine an event to have occurred historically, they do so on a scale of probability as opposed to one of absolute certainty. In the Sage Handbook of Historical Theory on page 211, it says, traditional history, Foucault points out, sees itself as neutral in terms of values, committed solely to the truth. Yet, in its will to knowledge, traditional history conceals what might be its own motives and desires. The genealogist, on the other hand, will openly admit his perspectives, his preferences in their controversy. He will attempt to understand his own motives and desires, fears and forebodings, his own situation within a specific historical context. The genealogist understands that the will to knowledge will never achieve universal truth. History can never achieve absolute knowledge, end quote. What then does it mean to be a historical fact? It means that an event at some time in history is considered to have been more probable to have occurred than less probable. If we were to apply a scale using a percentage at one end, we can have a 51% probability that an event happened to 49% that it did not. At the other end, we can have a 99% probability it did occur to 1% it did not. The reality, therefore, resides between 51% and 99% that an event could have happened. The error occurs when laymen hear the phrase historical fact and they associate this claim with one of absolution, when in fact it is to be considered within a range of probabilities. On page 17 of Professor Gladys's work, The Landscape of History, he says historians have always been, in this sense, abstractionists. The literal representation of reality is not their task, end quote. Tonight it may be asked of me, and it was, why do most historians agree that Jesus was crucified? The answer is simple. It's because they are basing their claim on the evidence which has survived, which they then interpret through the historical method and arrive at their conclusion. Professor Gladys further comments on page 41. He says, for historians too start with surviving structures, whether they be archives, artifacts, or even memories. They then deduce the processes that produced them, end quote. They can only start with what has survived. They then interpret this data and deduce a number of probable conclusions, which are supposed to be tested. Today, we are doing one such test. On page 26, he says, the historian's evidence is always incomplete. His perspective is always limited, and the thing itself is a vast expanding universe of particular events, ... End quote. At the time of Jesus, rebels were regularly crucified. Historians look for what they term continuities, meaning patterns that extend across time. Professor Gladys defines them on page 30 as phenomena that recur with sufficient regularity to make themselves apparent to us. Without such patterns, we'd have no basis for generalizing about human experience, end quote. Given that Jesus was identified as a rebel in Mark chapter 14, verse 48, and was meant to be crucified alongside another rebel, Jesus Barabbas, in Mark chapter 15, verse 7, historians use this continuity of the regular trend of crucifixion to propose that Jesus probably died through this method by virtue of being a rebel. This is one reason which Professor Bart Ehrman mentions in his book, Did Jesus Exist? He says, when looking at the crucifixion, he says, the Romans crucified lots of people all the time. That is a continuity right there. Ironically, in Mark chapter 14, verse 48, Jesus rebuffs the arrest attempt by identifying himself as not a rebel. This places the Christian, like Stephen, in a very awkward position of having to agree with the historian based on the trend of the occurrence of the crucifixion for rebels as a proof for the crucifixion, while also disagreeing with Jesus himself, who vocalizes that he is not a rebel. Kenny, does that mean 10 minutes left?
Yes, brother.
Thank you. The idea then is that historians have decided that Jesus was more likely than less likely to be crucified because the Romans routinely crucified people. The historical method, however, accounts for events which happen outside of the norm of continuities. Professor Gladys says in page 31 that they can involve what the chaos theorists call sensitive dependence on initial conditions, situations where an imperceptible shift at the beginning of a process can produce enormous changes at the end of it. They may result from the intersection of two or more continuities. Students of accidents know that when predictable processes come together in unprecedented ways, unpredictable consequences can follow. What all of these phenomena have in common is that they don't fall within the realm of repeated and therefore familiar experience. We generally learn about them only after they've happened. End quote. In other words, as Professor Gladys states on page 45, newly discovered evidence has to be compared with what's already known, end quote. By using this new evidence, we can also look at what Dr. Gary Habermas states in his work, The Historical Jesus, Ancient Evidence for the Life of Christ. On page 44, he references the use of the negative evidence principle. The principle is defined as when all the available evidence used to support the view that P is true is shown to be inadequate. End quote. In sum, if we have new evidence, that is new data, and if this new data allows us to reinterpret the original hypothesis against the current evidences, and if this data impacts the strength of these evidences, then our hypothesis must change. The probability of the hypothesis in our case that Jesus was crucified is allowed not only to be questioned, but more so determined not to be as probable as previously claimed when the new data is taken into consideration. In Did Jesus Exist? Professor Ehrman writes, to establish the historical probability of a saying, deed, or experience of Jesus, we want a large number of independent sources that can be shown not to be incorporating their own biases in the account in question, and that corroborate one another's report without showing any evidence of collaboration. And the closer these sources are in time to the events they narrate, the better, end quote. Modern scholarship accepts that while the New Testament's gospel accounts are the earliest surviving traditions about Jesus, they are not independent of each other, and they do actively attempt through editing and harmonization to corroborate what the other gospels say. Professor Philip Comfort, in his New Testament text and translation commentary, gives dozens of examples where harmonization has occurred throughout the New Testament. Dr. Timothy Mitchell, in citing James Royce and Ernest Caldwell, says that they both recognize a tendency to harmonize readings with remote parallels in other gospels, end quote. The text tradition of the gospels then don't merely harmonize their details in common stories, but also in stories which have little to do with each other. In the previous UBS Greek New Testament editions, they contained ratings for the variants in the text for the level of confidence that the textual critics had in their choices. 59% of these variants were chosen with difficulty and great difficulty in regards to their certainty. Only 8.9% of these variants reached the highest level of certainty itself. In Patristic and Text Critical Studies, the collected essays of William L. Peterson, on page 410, it stated that our critical editions do not present us with a text that was current in the year 150, 120, or 100, much less in 80 CE, end quote. This means that the tradition of the Gospels is not as early as is usually assumed. Roy Kotansky, in his work entitled The Early Papyri, Gospel Parallel Variants and the Text of the New Testament in the second century, which was published in Scribes and Their Remains, as edited by Professor Craig Evans and Jeremiah Johnson, argues convincingly that one can persuasively argue that the earliest period of the gospel text was not firmly fixed, but rather represented the product of much interpretive rewriting of tradition, end quote. He further states that this is This is Roy Kotansky. He further states that Helman Costa reminds us that whatever the consequences, the first 100 years from the time of writing of the gospel autographs to the appearance of their initial papyrological record in the period of circa 200 CE represented a span when substantial revisions were not only possible but highly likely, end quote. Historians then are doing the best they can with non-independent, edited, revised, reinterpreted, rewritten traditions spanning from the earliest period of the text of the Gospels. They can only realistically, as stated previously, make a decision based on what has survived, even with its severe and multiple defects. It is noteworthy that if the earlier sources preferred, then the Q document, which predates the Gospels entirely and which is based on the oral tradition, does not have Jesus predicting his death, dying a cross, or even being resurrected. Professor Dale Allison Jr. writes in his Jesus of Nazareth, Millenarian Prophet, on page 59, on the one hand, traditions that originated with Jesus were reformulated, translated, modified through additions, and given new meaning through secondary context, end quote. What then about the other criteria which scholars use to judge the historical Jesus? Embarrassment, discontinuity, and coherence. Professor Dale Allison Jr. writes in The Historical Christ and the Theological Jesus that a historian's Jesus is never just the consequences of reading sources through a screen of criteria. Rather, we conduct our intellectual rituals, that is, invent and or apply our criteria only after we have adopted some firm ideas about Jesus. Our criteria are less routes to our destination than ways of persuading others to end up where we have. End quote. Professor Dale says in the book again, Jesus of Nazareth, he remarks on page 2 that these criteria appeal to common sense, end quote. But he then says, reflection, however, creates more than a little unease. Coherence, for example, is a rather subjective thing. Two things that fit together according to one exegete may seem irreconcilable to another, end quote. On page 3, the issue is not whether we can find tensions, but whether they mean much. Consistency and inconsistency are very much in the eye of the beholder. End quote. And on page 4, the criterion of the similarity, whose implicit notion that the new is good may be the offspring of the modern idea of progress, is no less troublesome than the criterion of consistency. As others have remarked, it can at best tell us what was distinctive, not what was characteristic of Jesus, end quote. He then says, all too often, however, this similarity has been misused as a means of separating the authentic from the inauthentic. That is a way of eliminating items from the corpus of authentic materials. End quote. He says on page 5, beyond this, the objection of Morna Hooker, first raised 3 decades ago, this book was written in 1998, has never been successfully answered. We just do not know enough about first century Judaism or early Christianity to make the criterion very reliable, end quote. Finally, he says on page 6, whether or not one shares my misgivings about the similarity, coherence, and embarrassment, it is certain that they and other criteria have not led us into the promised land of scholarly consensus. If our tools were designated to overcome subjectivity and bring order to our discipline, then they have failed, end quote. And on page 7, apparently we must reconcile ourselves to the unhappy fact that our methods are defective and may often mislead us, end quote. As for the method I'm employing tonight, I am not making a new claim or a different one. Rather, I'm saying that it makes sense why the historians arrived at the conclusion they did, and I affirm that, as they say, these evidences have severe problems and issues which devalue the probability that the crucifixion occurred. In this sense, I have adopted, as Dr. Locona defines, methodical neutrality. In this method, I have looked at the claims and evidences that those who affirm the view that Jesus was crucified and found them to be applicable to the negative evidence principle as stated by Dr. Habermas. My interlocutor tonight presumes the Gospels are true and its message reliable, and so he has adopted methodical credulity, which bears the burden of proof. I am not offering a new hypothesis, but rather examining the current one on its own merits as advocated by those who accept it as true. That the gospel versions of events are the only narratives to survive do not necessitate that they are the best versions of what actually happened, or that they are the only narratives to have existed at all. Thank you.
Alhamdulillah, that was 20 minutes.
Almost.
Okay, okay, Stephen. Okay, I guess he. All right. Alhamdulillah. Okay, so Brother Ijaz, whenever you're ready, let me reset the timer for your 10-minute first rebuttal.
Okay, tell me when I can begin.
Okay, brother, you can begin right now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Stephen, for that non-response. So you started off with quoting Simon, I think it's Simon Greenleaf. And the funny thing is you placed the burden of proof on me when, as you started off, you implied that the Gospels were true. That's what you quoted of Mr. Greenleaf. And he presumed that it was true. And therefore, the burden of proof is actually on you. What you have not done tonight is demonstrate the claims that you have appealed to. Rather, the burden of proof is on you and not on me. Remember, I have used methodical neutrality, not methodical credulity. And as Michael O'Connor says, as he agrees, the burden of proof would be on you. I sure guarantee that all of this information is new to you. I'll tell you why it's new to you, because you do not understand the historical method. Here is the point I want to raise. You repeated multiple times that the method that Ijaz is using, we can't know anything about history. I challenge Stephen. Tell me what my method is or what my principles were. I quoted dozens of methods and principles, and you will notice not once could he say this principle that Ijaz used is wrong. That principle that Ijaz used is insufficient. He cannot name the method, nor can he name the principles that I have employed tonight, and therefore to call them wrong or insufficient is a legitimate non-response. You continued by, you misquoted Dr. Khattab's translation. I corrected you on that. I realized that you did not respond to my correction of your misquotation. Continuing, you quoted Qur'an Surah 19, in which Jesus says, peace be upon me the day that I was born, the day that I will die, and the day that I will be raised again. You contradicted yourself. Why? Because Zechariah says the same about his son in Surah 19, verse 15. Now you said, well, didn't John die? Well, the thing is, both of them are in the future tense. At the time that Zechariah is speaking in the Quran, his son had not died. He's making a prayer for his son in the future, as is Jesus in the Quran. So if you're going to use the same verses, you have to understand what they fundamentally mean. You continued by quoting Quran Surah 3, verse 55, in which case it mentions Mutawafika and Warafiuka, that he was caused, quote unquote, according to you to die and to be raised. I do suggest that you read the Hermania commentary series on Logos. It actually mentions by Ibarra Collins, I think it's on the Gospel of John, that the terms anestomai and egairo were non-literal terms as used in the Gospels, and therefore they do not refer to literal deaths either in the Greek or in the Arabic Quran. I suggest that you brush up on your scholarship. Interestingly, when you quoted Quran Surah 4, Ayah 157, you will notice that you put the blame on Allah as if you had read a translation where it said Allah made it appear so. But rather, I pointed out already that the Quran says it was made to appear so. It does not say Allah made it appear so. Further, I pointed out to you that the Quran says it was made to appear so, therefore the claim appears in history. That is to say that people at some point in time converged multiple traditions, and it became the tradition that Christ had died. It is your responsibility to demonstrate that Allah made it appear so, because as the translation you have read contradicts your claim, and as you said you don't know Arabic, you can only read the English. Well, please read the English a second time so you can correct yourself. Stephen asked me what position do I hold to. It's interesting because you'll notice that in the rebuttal he still did not ask what position I held to. That is peculiar. If you don't know what position I hold to and you don't know what methodology I use and what the principles are, then how can you claim I'm wrong? So I challenge you to tell me the methodology that I used. You said that the Quran comes 600 years later. Most of the manuscripts, which include the last verses in the Gospels, which mention the crucifixion and resurrection, come several hundred years later as well. I think I pointed out to you and to many others that the Gospel, I think, of Mark contains 2 verses that only find their being in the 19th century with Westcott and Hort. So 600 years later might be bad, but I think 1900 years later is significantly worse. But then again, what do I know about mathematics? You mentioned here, we're not told exactly what happened. Well, this is a non-argument. Again, I don't imagine that when the Christians went into India, they knocked on doors. Hey, do you guys still believe in Vishnu? And then the Hindu says, before I could give up belief in Vishnu and Hanuman, first tell me what happened to Vishnu and Hanuman. I don't think that's an argument that anyone ever makes that is reasonable. Let us continue. You mentioned here, let me quote you now, Stephen. You said, to Paperboy in the comments, I said methodical neutrality. Please learn to listen. You people are deafer than a deaf man. To quote what Stephen said, I don't read Arabic, so I have to go by the Muslim translations that Muslims produced. One, that is the fallacy of argument from ignorance. It is not reasonable that because you can't read Arabic that you cannot look up the works of Arabic scholars and find their translations and their methodology. If I could do it for Greek and Hebrew, you can do it for Arabic. It's one click away on the internet. To then say that I have to go by the translations that Muslims produced, that is again an appeal to authority because the Quran is not written in English. It is revealed in Arabic. And so our primary source, like you said, we have to go to the primary source. Why did you not go to the primary source when it comes to the Quran? Strangely enough, you made the claim that the Quran makes 3 claims, and then you only made 2 claims after that. So I think you need to work on that a bit more. Let's continue. You said a bunch of other things, right? You quoted Bat Ehrman. Let's work this out. I pointed out to you that Bat Ehrman says history is based on probability, not certainty. So what is the point in quoting Bat Ehrman to me? I'll tell you this. If the debate is on historicity and you're going to quote historians, it's not just enough to quote their conclusions, but you also have to quote their method and their evidences, the way that they evaluate something. Because I'll tell you what, the method that you use to come to the conclusion that Christ died is very different from the method that Bat Ehrman used. And both of you don't grade the evidence on the same level with the same level of criterion. So he is using a methodology where the Gospels are anonymous. They're made up, they contain fiction, they contain errors. So you can use, what you're basically using is 2 contradictory methods to arrive at the conclusion, ignoring the fact that the method counts just as much as the evidence itself. You ask me, Ijaz, how do you know how anything happened historically? I just told you, using the historical method. You mentioned to me here, but your methodology, how can we know if anything happened 1,000 or 1,500 years ago? I am using the same methodology that all historians use. It is not the case that because all historians use the same method that they end up with the same conclusion. Hence why I quoted Professor Dale C. Allison Jr., why I quoted Gary Habermas, why I quoted Michael O'Connor, why I quoted Professor Gladys. I quoted even from the Sage Handbook on Historiography. So I quoted from a wide body of scholarly literature to contradict your points. You mentioned you appeal to the Gospels. I already pointed out to you. You yourself said we must go to the earliest evidence. You went to the Didache, which is fine, sure. But what precedes the Didache? Well, the Gospels. What precedes the Gospels? The Q document. Well, if the Q document is the earliest and it is it's the most evidentiary and it does not mention the crucifixion and the resurrection, you, Stephen, need to account for that. You said to me, Ijaz, are you asking for absolute certainty? That's a ridiculous question. Did you pay attention to what I said? I said that history is on a scale of probability. You said to us that we have the testimony of Peter in Acts. No, we do not. That is an unfounded assertion. Remember, you believe in methodical credulity. You presuppose that these things are true. It is the onus on you, therefore, to qualify that claim. Saying that I am methodically neutral, I have to wait for you to qualify these claims before I can engage with your methodology and evidence. You need to read the scholarly literature, Stephen. You quoted Josephus and Tacitus. Let me point out that Josephus says, who is called Christ. So in this way, he's just repeating what other people say. He himself was a Jew that never accepted Christ as the Messiah, never accepted Christianity. That goes to tell you if he had seen all these magical signs and wonders that the apostles had done, yet still rejected Christianity, would tell you that the faith did not exist on the same plain level of reasoning that you're appealing to. Tacitus writes about the year 115, so he's a non-contemporaneous eyewitness. All he is doing is recording something which the Christians believed at his point in time. Interestingly, He uses that quote. He does not mention that Tacitus does not mention the crucifixion by name. I do believe that Tacitus does mention the crucifixion just by a metaphor. However, what is his purpose in quoting what the beliefs of the Christians were? He was using it to demonize them as a political act. He made a false claim in that statement that the Christians started the fire attributed to Nero. Now, if Tacitus could lie about what the Christians did, then he can also lie about their beliefs. But it is, again, on you to justify those claims. In other words, I have gone through every single point that you have written in your opening statement and in your first rebuttal, and I have not found any sufficient claims presented. I do hope, and I beg you, Stephen, please engage with what I have said about the historical method and the evidences that historians use. The topic is not what the Quran says, but about the historicity of the crucifixion, not what the Quran says about the crucifixion. Thank you.
You can start whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So I noticed that Stephen still did not answer the question, what was my methodology and what were the principles that I used? Rather, he repeated some quotes from Bart Ehrman, the same Bart Ehrman that says it's based on probability, not certainty. Stephen believes it's a fact with absolute certainty, so he disagrees with historical consensus. He does not fundamentally understand how history is done. You said to me, Ijaz and I are at crossroads on how one does history. At no point have you given how you do history, Stephen. Here's how you do history. The Gospels are true, therefore what follows is what I believe. That's what you started off with. I asked you already. Using the principles by your own scholars. I don't know if you like Michael Locone. I beg you to answer that. He lays out, and I defined for you what methodical credulity was. You confirmed you appealed to methodical credulity. So you presume the Gospels are true. Then your argument follows. As your own scholarship says, you need to qualify that claim because I am holding a methodically neutral position. So all I have to do is sit back and wait for you to evidence your claims. By not evidencing your claims, there is one of two conclusions. One, you don't understand the evidence for the claims that you're making, or two, you do not have the evidence for the claims that you are making. I think that both are actually true. You mentioned to me that Bart Ehrman uses neutrality and skepticism. No, Bart Ehrman is not a methodical skeptic. In fact, he grants many things in the New Testament that many other people would not. You are misinformed on the position of Dr. Ehrman. You said that Ehrman, and I'm going to quote you here in your rebuttal, you said Ehrman says all scholars. No, you yourself read the quote. It was virtually all scholars. It does not mean that all scholars are always right. You said that Josephus made a historical statement. Yes, he made a statement in history that people called Jesus the Christ in the same way that they said he was crucified. Josephus himself did not accept the claim that Christ was the Messiah. If Christ was the Messiah, why did Josephus not accept it? You might say, well, we have to go back. Perhaps it is Josephus knew things which allowed him to reject that Jesus was the Messiah. So I beg the question, do you accept that Josephus never accepted that Christ was the Messiah? He insisted he was called Messiah, not even the Messiah. So either the Jews were expecting multiple Messiahs, which would be the position of Josephus as a Jew, or you are wrong in what you claim about Josephus. Let me quote you again, Stephen. You said that I said everyone is making a mistake or a lie. I've actually never said that. I pointed out to you that what Tacitus says in the year 115, or after the year 115 rather, is that Christians started the fire that destroyed Rome under Nero. Now, all historians disagree on that claim. So in one breath, you want me to accept what Tacitus says when it suits you, but you're not willing to accept when scholarship says that Tacitus is wrong about something. So you need to get your methodology and your evidence clear. This back and forth game is inconsistent, and an inconsistent claim does not make a man. Let us continue. You said that I, Ijaz, did not refute anything you said earlier on interpreting the verses of the Quran. Wrong. I read from Quran Surah 19. Wrong. I read from Quran Surah 3 verse 55. I gave you the definitions of Mutawafika and Wafafiuka. So again, Stephen, either it is that you are sufficiently inconsistent on what you have claimed, or you have not been able to demonstrate your claim. Lastly, you said no sane person would preach a crucified savior. Here is the problem with that. Did the context in which the Jews live, was it a period of Hellenization? Yes. Did the Greek and Greco-Roman people accept that God can suffer and die? Yes. Therefore, it is not insanity. It is not See, the thing is, your argument works only out of context. But the argument that I am using is works within the context of first century antiquity, and basically that is that the cultures interplayed and there was an exchange of ideas. Even for goodness sake, the name of a Jewish place of preaching and worship, synagogue, is Greek in and of itself. So just to point this out here, the Jews themselves had a cultural exchange of ideas that some of them began to accept that God can suffer and that God can die is only a product of their time and place. So while I operate within history, you seem to live in a land where there was no cultural exchange and the Jews lived in a vacuum. I don't know whether that is ridiculous or if it is inconsistent. I think it is both. So unfortunately, Stephen, you've only made 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 points, which I've all successfully rebutted. You mentioned to me, what can I dig up that you did or did not say? Let's see here. Again, I put the point to you. You said we should go to the earliest evidence. The earliest evidence is the Q document. The Q document at no point mentions the crucifixion or the resurrection. The question then comes into play. Not even Christ is predicted in any of those sayings in the Q document, which historians generally agree upon. Again, here you contradict what the historians say and believe. So we have no parables predicting his death, no crucifixion, no resurrection. If that is the earliest source, and you told me, Ijaz, let's go to the earliest sources, then the earliest sources contradict what you believe. I beg the question, Stephen, are you actually interested in the sources that historians use, or are you simply going to close your eyes and say, oh, I believe in the Gospels, therefore the Gospels are true? Again, I have repeated multiple times, Stephen, you hold to methodical credulity by your own standard, by your own statements. And using that methodical credulity, the burden of proof is upon you. I think what has happened here today is that you did not expect me to go into the historical method. You did not expect me to quote the historians on how they arrive at the conclusions that they do. You did not expect me to define the phrase historical fact. So unfortunately, because you did not expect those things, you did not prepare for them. But it is not sufficient enough to quote the conclusions of scholars without understanding their method. Because if that was the case, imagine you were imagining that you were in the first century. Imagine if I was around Jesus in the first century. He says the scribes and the lawgivers are wrong. And then I turn around and say to him, no, the scribes and lawgivers, they're scholars, and they're unanimous that you're wrong. So in this case, I have become more like Christ and you have become more like a Pharisee. You choose to maintain the status quo without looking closer into the details, whereas I have gone into the details, gone into the methodology, and gone into the scholarship. The question I ask their viewers, why can the Christian not do the same? Why do they have to repeat themselves ad infinitum without even going an inch deep into the water? Thank you.
Okay, brother, and that was your 7 minutes.
Let's see now. Okay, let's go. Ijaz, was there a historical Jesus?
Yes.
Okay, how do you know?
Using historical sources.
What historical sources?
So we use the Gospels primarily, and then we use everything outside of it. However, we use that within the framework of there are caveats here. So as Bart Ehrman says in Did Jesus Exist? Because you asked me to use him yesterday, I'm using him for you today. He actually says in Did Jesus Exist? Just because something fits contextually within the first century related to Jesus does not mean that it is true. So based on that, we look for what I mentioned were continuities, things which were common, which should evidence that claim. Based on that, I think the evidence of his existence is overwhelming. That is my answer. Thank you.
Okay. Did Bart Ehrman believe that Jesus was crucified?
Yes, so does most other people. Doesn't make it true. He's not God. Next question.
Okay. No, that's not what I asked. Did Bart
That's what I answered.
Okay, gentlemen, let me intervene just briefly because we just had about 5 questions asked.
No, he has the full 10 minutes to keep asking me.
Okay, brother. Okay, so let me reset this because okay. Okay, go ahead. Let's go ahead, proceed. Go ahead.
I'm confused. How much time do I have left? Because I was asking questions.
Yeah.
He only took like 10 seconds. So 30 seconds. So give him 9 minutes, 30 seconds.
Okay, sure. Okay.
If you want, you can give him half an hour. It doesn't matter. Whatever he needs, give it to him, please.
Okay. Josh, did Jesus die by crucifixion?
That is what historians claim, and that's what historical sources claim, which have survived.
Okay, but I'm not asking what historians say. I'm asking what you believe.
What I believe, when it comes to debates, I have theological beliefs and I have methodological beliefs. So when it comes in terms of the Quran, no, as a Muslim, I do not believe that Christ was crucified, but I also affirm what the Quran says, that this is a claim which exists in history. Therefore, I believe as a Muslim, no, that Christ did not die, but I also accept, because of the Quran and because of the evidences outside of the Quran, that historians do claim and that he was crucified and killed.
Okay. Next question then is, so you do not believe that he actually, that it was a historical fact or a historical probability that he died by crucifixion. Is that correct?
I think using probability, it's a high probability that he would have been killed. But as I mentioned in my opening statement, when historians look at continuities in regards to probabilities, they actually point out that things could be outside of the scope of continuities. And therefore, just because something is highly probable does not mean that it is fully possible and therefore absolute. So I accounted for that in my opening statement.
Okay, so you want a 100% certainty that Jesus died by crucifixion?
Repeat that question again.
You want a 100% certainty that Jesus died by crucifixion?
Am I allowed to ask you what you mean by that? Let me answer. Maybe you can clarify.
Clarify it.
So what I don't understand in regards to the question is, are you asking me in regards to my belief as a Muslim, or are you asking me as when I do use the historical method?
Well, let's go with the historical method for the present.
So using the historical method based on the principle of continuities, scholars would generally say that it is more probable than less probable that he died.
Okay, what is your position on that then?
My position that it is probable, as is the position of all scholars.
Okay. But as a Muslim, so basically what you're doing, no, that's an argument. I can't do that. So I'll have to say that. So let me see with this. Does Tacitus claim that Pilate crucified Jesus?
He doesn't use the word crucified, but he says suffered the most severe penalty.
That he suffered the severe punishment.
That's what he says, but as I duly pointed out in my, my first rebuttal and second rebuttal, historians agree that that section of the text contains both a truth and a lie, and that his claim, one of his claims basically, was politically motivated. Yeah.
But he does make the claim that Jesus died by crucifixion, or died.
He
died under Pontius Pilate.
And he writes that almost 80 to 90 years after the fact. I'm not sure how that is meant to be weighty.
Okay. What evidence would you want? Would you accept that Jesus died by crucifixion? As certain as we can come to anything that happens historically.
So that's a difficult question because it's a hypothetical. The thing is, with historical sources, we can actually only have literary sources, and we can have archaeological evidence. Because our literary sources are so long after the time of Jesus, and because the archaeological evidences themselves are either non-existent or too long afterwards, I would say that generally that is what historians would seek to use, but I cannot answer hypothetical without some frame of reference.
Okay, well, let's move on then. When you talk about archaeological evidence, there are people out there who claim to have the true cross of Jesus, and of course there's a shroud of Turin. Is that the type of evidence that you want?
That would be useful evidence, but as the historians have pointed out, as I said in my opening statement as well, each evidence needs to be assessed under its own merits, and so that is a very complex question to answer, merely based on the fact that the two types of evidences you just mentioned are two distinct things in and of themselves. And so there is quite a lot of processes which need to be undertaken to arrive at a probable conclusion there as to their veracity.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not absolutely sure that you could produce the true cross of the true cross.
I could try.
or the true cross or the Shroud of Turin. I'm not absolutely convinced on that, but there are people who actually claim of that. I'm just trying to, I was just trying to understand what you do about the archaeological evidence, but what archaeological evidence do we have for a lot of things that happened back there. I mean, there was some not too long ago where we had the ossuary of James, the brother of Jesus. Do you reject that?
No, but I do agree that scholars differ as to which James and which Jesus it refers to, because both of those names were very common in the first century. And so one cannot fully conclude that it distinctly belonged to James, the brother of Jesus himself.
Okay, I know you touched on it a bit, but considering what crucifixion was in the Jewish mind, why would anyone make up such a story of how it was, make up such a story? And how is it that Peter and Paul were able to bamboozle so many people in such a short period of time? Again, we have the writings of Paul, especially in 1 Corinthians 15, where he definitely talks about the crucifixion, and also in Galatians, where he talks about the crucifixion. And that's all dated between 49 to 55 with it. So how was it that, this horrific message was, that is so repugnant to so many people? How was that able to spread so quickly?
I would say it was not repugnant for a person to suffer. That some people believed he was the Messiah and accepted that both he suffered and was the Messiah is one group of people. But by and large, the Jews did not accept Christianity. They did not accept Jesus as the Messiah. And so they had no problem saying that, yes, sure, that guy was crucified. Doesn't matter to us because he was not the Messiah. That some Jews believed in it, then you would have to first justify what their level of understanding about the Messiah was in the first place. As you would know, there was no one understanding of who the Messiah was meant to be. There seems three versions of three different Messiahs that were meant to come. I don't see you referencing their ideas on the Messiah or comparing and contrasting with the other groups of Jews at that point in time. What you are effectively asking me to say is to speculate on the knowledge of the Jews that did accept him as the Messiah and also accepted him, that he died. And then you ask me to speculate as to what their understanding of the Messiah was. As the historical evidence and as you take it to be in the Gospels, I do not see any point at which they were embarrassed or in which case they say that they are ashamed that Jesus died for their sins.
When you look at crucifixion in the first century, and it says that in Deuteronomy, which is quoted by Paul in Galatians, says, "Cursed is anyone who's hung on a tree." So again, I'm not really too sure how this would be acceptable for anybody, considering that what the Pharisees would have understood about someone being hung. In fact, in the gospel accounts, that's why Jesus was taken down early, so that they would not defile the Sabbath with not only Jesus, but you have the other two people crucified. So again, what Jewish groups would have embraced Jesus being crucified?
That speculation, it would actually be difficult to answer. I do believe that if you are a Jew in that first century period and you do accept that Isaiah 53 does refer to Jesus, then you can justify your belief regardless of how difficult it is in saying it was a prophecy, therefore it is true, in the same way that many Christians do that today. They claim that the idea should have been embarrassing, but they don't provide any evidence that the disciples themselves, who are the only people to have accepted that he was the Messiah and crucified at the same time, according to your own belief, that they were embarrassed by this crucifixion. You mentioned the Pharisees. The Pharisees did not accept that Jesus was the Messiah or that he was crucified. So I think that question is not only irrelevant, it is nonsensical.
Actually, that's my point entirely. You mentioned Q a lot. Could you please show me or direct me to a place where I can actually examine the document Q?
Yeah, the same place that you can find the autographs of the New Testament. Good luck with that.
So go to the autographs of the New Testament, which basically are so corrupt I can't trust them. But so where does Q come from?
It comes from the New Testament, which you believe in, which scholars filter out the corruption. So while most of it is corrupted, what the scholars do with the Q document, again, this demonstrates you don't know what you're speaking about. The Q document is what they filter out from the corruptions, not what is corrupted in the first place.
Okay, gentlemen, that is the first round of Crossfire, first 10 minutes. And so let me reset the timer for another 10 minutes, inshallah. And Ijaz, it'll now be your time to ask Stephen questions, inshallah.
Before I ask my question, Stephen, I don't want there to be any miscommunication. Is my voice and my speed of speech clear and straightforward enough to understand what I'm saying and asking you?
Well, the voice is certainly clear enough, so I won't have any problem understanding the words. I maybe have a tough time interpreting the words, but I don't have a tough time hearing the words.
No problem. So I will try to take my time. What's your name? Kenny. I forgot your name. What's going on these days? You may begin my time. Thank you.
Okay, brother. And did I mention out there that Ijaz is single and he's extremely handsome for all the Muslim sisters out there? Go ahead, brother.
Alhamdulillah. I invite applications, and that's a serious statement, by the way. So, Stephen, my first question to you is, when Paul converted to Christianity, does the New Testament tell us that he converted due to the recent history about Jesus, or was his conversion due to a personal experience and his personal encounter with Jesus?
Well, according to the book of Acts and according to Paul's own words, he claimed to have had a personal experience with Jesus on the road to Damascus.
Brilliant. So the second question then, if Paul wasn't convinced or came to the faith through interacting with contemporaries, interacting with the eyewitnesses, or interacting even with people who knew the apostles, why should I be convinced when he rejected all of that and it needed actually a personal interjection for him to come to faith? Why should I accept the history when he himself did not, and he needed a personal experience to do so?
Well, I think that when we talk about conversion, very often someone will have, people have used the phrase, an on the road to Damascus experience. But when we look at, especially in the book of Galatians, we talk about Paul, that he says he spent 3 years in Arabia. And most scholars believe, to my understanding, that it was with Jesus where he was being taught by the Lord. We see that also hinted at in 1 Corinthians 15, where when he speaks about, I did deliver to you that which I received, which is my understanding, a rabbinic phrase about this teaching, and that as he goes on to Jerusalem, when he goes up to Jerusalem to meet with Peter or Cephas and James, the brother of the Lord, he is instructed by them, and this is where people argue that, again in 1 Corinthians 15:3, where that Christ died according to the scriptures, he rose again according to the scriptures, that this was an early creed of the church, and if we take that Jesus was crucified in 30, that Paul was converted in 33, and then he's in Jerusalem in 36, and the early church already had believed that that Jesus had died by crucifixion.
Okay, that has nothing to do with the question I asked. I'll ask the question again. Please try to remain on topic and answer it. I did not ask you what Paul did in the desert. I did not ask you who he met, when he met them, none of those things. What I asked you was, if the historical evidence at the time of Paul did not convince him, but that it took a personal experience with Jesus to do so, why should it convince me?
Well, I mean, how does one answer? Do you want this? Basically, is for me to speculate, get in the mind of Paul. I don't know where I can. I mean, we look at basically is what Paul's experience is. He was a scholar. He was a Jewish scholar, and from the reading of the of Moses and the prophets, he came to those conclusions. It's interesting that I believe it's in the Gospel of Luke. With this, you have the story of the rich man and Lazarus, and at the end of the story is the rich man, whose some people think name was Dives, had asked, well, send one of my brothers back, and the answer was, they have the answer from Abraham was no, they have Moses and the prophets. And so what? The answer is, well, no. If someone were to come from the dead, they would believe. And the answer comes back again, if they do not believe Moses and the prophets, they will not believe. And that's quite frankly the reason that you don't believe, is that you've rejected reject Moses and the prophets, and that's why you don't believe. So anything that I say, or even will never make you believe.
So again, that was not the question I asked. I'll ask it one more time. Please pay attention specifically to what I am asking. The historical evidence did not convince Paul. It took a personal encounter. I'm not asking to get into the mind of Paul. I'm saying, why should anyone else be convinced by the historical evidence if it did not convince Paul himself?
Well, you're not convinced by the historical evidence that I brought forward. Basically, what you've done is you've presented a number of, a historical method of how to interpret the scriptures, or how to interpret what actually happened, and you've drawn your own conclusions with it. Again, it's I'm trying to answer the question to the best of my ability.
So generally it would seem as if you're unable to answer the question. I just want to point out that the question entails in it, Stephen, not what I personally believe, but the question was, if the historical evidence did not convince Paul, why should anyone else be convinced by it? In other words, I'm saying that I don't believe in historical evidence because Paul himself also was not convinced by it. My third question, do you know what social formation is?
No.
Okay. So I'm going to give a general definition because it's included in the question that I have to ask you. Are you familiar with Brett Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court justice that was confirmed last year?
Yes.
Right. So you are aware that there was a claim of rape made against him, yes? Or
Yes.
sexual assault, yeah?
Yeah.
And is it the case, or is it not the case, that many Democrats and, in fact, politicians argue that he was, in fact, a sexual assaulter?
Yes.
But they had no evidence he was a sexual assaulter.
To my understanding.
Great. So social formation is when historians ask the question, why did a group of people come together in the first place? So your claim to belief would be that the disciples came together in their belief about Jesus because of the crucifixion, yes?
Well, they claim that they were eyewitnesses to the actual event.
Right. So the claim that the actual event of the crucifixion happened.
Yes.
But I've just demonstrated to you that people can come to a belief without having first-hand evidence, and therefore using the evidence of social formation, it cannot on its own basis prove that the crucifixion happened. Thank you for that point, Stephen.
I don't agree. I don't necessarily agree with that.
Okay, so then tell me, using social formation, why you don't agree.
Well, I think that, we all have our biases. I have my biases. You have yours. You agree?
Well, it's not my turn to be asked questions, Stephen. So your answer to my question is that you have biases, that's why you believe. That's interesting because I asked you to use the historical method and you seemed unable to do so. You mentioned to me...
I said we all have our biases regarding that. I freely admit that we wouldn't be having this debate if we didn't have our biases.
Sure. No problem.
Our own conclusions regarding that. But why Paul did not believe at first was possibly he wasn't there. God, the Bible doesn't tell us whether he was there or not. We don't know.
I didn't say that he had to be there at the event. I actually had said to you that he interacted with eyewitnesses. He was persecuting the Christians who went around preaching the crucified and risen Christ. And my point was, he did not seem to be convinced by the contemporaries of that event in his own time. And that is a problem. So my last question, because I'm almost out of time here. My last question,
brother, you have a minute and 30 seconds.
Oh, that's a long time, Kenny.
Yes,
Yeah. Early, dude. Come on.
I gave the wrong indication. Go ahead.
No problem. May Allah reward you and bless you. Amen. So, Stephen, do you understand the difference between methodical credulity and methodical neutrality?
I think I do now a bit.
Okay. Do you understand that this debate was on the topic of the historicity of the crucifixion?
That's why I prepared what I prepared.
Okay, so can you let me know what works on the historical method you studied in preparation for this debate?
I didn't study those, but I don't know. I don't understand. You really understood. Basically, we looked at was Jesus crucified? I presented what most scholars would consider a historical method. I quoted scholars, many of whom you agree with, that Jesus died by crucifixion, as was Mike Lacona and Gary Habernath and Bart Ehrman and a host of others believe that Jesus died by crucifixion.
Okay, did you get help from Louis Dizon in preparation for this debate?
Why is that relevant?
It's a question. I'm asking the questions.
Well, you can keep asking. I looked at a number of sources, with that. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, I did not receive help. No problem. Kenny, I give up the rest of my time. Thank you.
Oh, brother, you had about 10 seconds left. So, okay.
Well, I love you. That's why I gave up the time. So you can get a break. I mean, we're all sweating from the heat. Like, Stephen, do you not see my face glowing with the sweat? My room is on fire right now. I'm wearing a shirt, Stephen. You have me wearing a shirt. I am dying in the heat.
I got a shirt on too. We bought a fan today at Walmart.
Okay, so with that being said, we have now reached the portion of the debate where we will take audience questions.